Hello everyone, welcome to lecture number 11 for EDUC2065, Professionalism, Leadership and Management in Early Childhood. So on the agenda for today's lecture is the topic of occupational safety, so safety as it pertains to staff working in a long daycare centre or family daycare centre or OSH. Also looking at staff well-being, in particular how to manage symptoms of stress and how to reduce stress in the workplace, and also how to manage risk and manage hazards that pertain to staff, because in a previous lecture we've looked at managing and reducing hazards or removing hazards for children, but now we're going to be focusing on how do we do that for staff who work with children. The Occupational Safety and Health Act of 2000, so the OSH Act, together with the Occupational Safety and Health Regulations of 96, are the principal legislation that govern occupational safety and health in Western Australian workplaces. Employers have a responsibility to ensure the safety, health and welfare of all employees, children, their parents, community members and other persons who are legally present on school premises. According to the provisions of the OSH Act and the Code of Ethics, all childcare providers and schools have a legal and ethical responsibility to put in place procedures and processes to develop, promote and maintain a safe and healthy working environment for all members of staff. And this includes carers, teachers, children, their parents, guardians, community members and other persons who are legally present on school premises. So some of those legal responsibilities that are in place include policies to identify risk management, and these are to make sure that any potential hazards in areas such as the buildings, grounds, or use of machinery and equipment, use and storage of chemicals and other hazardous substances, manual handling processes, sun protection including staff, workplace security, hygiene and infection control, first aid, and commitment to ongoing staff training are occurring regularly. One example of how this can manifest is part of the uniform policy for most places is that all staff wear closed shoes. And even in the heat of summer when we might typically be throwing on some thongs if we were not in the workplace, often workplaces actually require us to have closed shoes because it poses a risk not to in terms of lots of those different aspects, things like any hazards that could fall and hurt on your feet or you could step on, any chemicals, and also it's a hygiene concern. Managing risks like this, risk management, is the foundation of OC health and safety and of keeping children safe. And as with all risk management, you identify the workplace risk or hazard, so this might be through checklists or it could be through regular inspections. Then you assess the risk. How likely is it? What's that probability that it might happen or cause harm? And how great is the risk? That's the severity or gravity of that harm. Then we need to control or manage the risk. So we've got to actually do something about it. We might have to remove a piece of equipment, repair a piece of equipment. We may need to change a process to be able to make sure that the hazard is minimised or removed. And then the fourth thing we need to do is to monitor and improve safety. So this can often mean that we're documenting a lot. We're recording everything that we've done, the steps that we have taken, or the steps that we have avoided to be able to minimise that harm or reduce that risk. Employers are responsible for ensuring that all staff are provided with adequate knowledge and training to make certain they can legally comply with all risk management procedures. So employees do have a legal obligation to cooperate with their employers to maintain a safe workplace. So it sort of goes both ways. There's a legal obligation on employers, but there's also a legal obligation on employees to stick to the processes and policies that have been put in place. Some examples of some OC health safety policies and procedures as they pertain to the standards that are set out by Safe Work Australia Council. These include some that are relevant to safety in childcare. Manual handling refers to how we actually lift equipment and how we actually lift children if we do need to in the care environment. And this can be also including things like when children need to be manually handled, so we need to actually touch them in a way that keeps them safe. And sometimes this can manifest in In a childcare centre, it can be how we lift children to be able to care for them. How do they actually get up and get down from changing tables and those sorts of things. And a lot of those processes are involved in learning how to safely handle those children. As they get older, occasionally the need can arise where you might need to intervene if two children are having a physical altercation, and there are ways that you can actually approach children and how you can actually use your body and hands and arms and strength to be able to keep them safe. Hazardous substances we should be well aware of. Most childcare centres and schools will have clear policies about storage of chemicals in a safe way, whether they be locked with child safety locks in cupboards or whether they are completely out of reach or a combination of those, or sometimes cleaning medications and things like that might need to have a completely separate storage solution. So management of hazardous substances certainly pertains to the role of a childcare worker. Infection control is one that requires regular monitoring, as do most of these. We do know that we need to be aware of lots of different diseases and how they might manifest and symptoms and things like that. We need to be very on top of these policies and procedures so that we can prevent cross-infection and cross-contamination. So sometimes the food preparation areas have a very strict set of guidelines for food preparation and things like that, and also just we're all aware of how different diseases can operate and how they're passed on. COVID has informed a lot of our practices about hand washing and hygiene, and sometimes it is the responsibility, regularly it's the responsibility of a childcare worker to assess that a child is not well enough to be at childcare, and that can mean that we need to actually control the infection by calling the parent and asking them to come and collect their child and keep them home until their symptoms have subsided and they're no longer contagious. Sun protection, this includes staff, and it can be very easy in a school or childcare environment to make sure all the children have got sunscreen on, make sure they're wearing their hats, and then forget to do the same for ourselves. If we are outside every day, whether that be on yard duty or whether we are doing some outdoor play, we need to understand that the nature of where we live, the continent in which we live, and long-term exposure to sun can cause some serious damage and harm. So we do need to make sure that we are also protecting ourselves and the staff with whom we work. Stress management I will touch on a little bit later on this lecture, and also with conflict resolution, which can sometimes obviously relate to stressful situations in the workplace. Labelling workplace substances really clearly, especially if they've been decanted from their original containers into other containers. When we do that, we need to make sure that they are still effectively labelled, including due dates and expiry dates and ingredients and things like that. Environmental tobacco smoke and reducing that risk. Smoking is prohibited in all childcare centre buildings. Some of the standards from Safe Work Australia Council state that if somebody is on their break and they are going outside or off-site, I should say, to have a cigarette, there is a minimum expectation that they're at least 2 metres away from entry and they should not be in view of the children. So different centres may have stricter than that minimum policies and procedures around smoking. And some of the regulations and laws as it pertains to vaping are not yet solidified, but a lot of centres are looking at establishing some policies and procedures around vaping near childcare centres as well. Most centres will have a complaints procedure, so what is the actual sort of process or flow chart that can be provided to parents who are the contact people. What's that sort of chain of command in terms of how do you lodge and register a complaint if there's something that has happened that a parent needs to complain about, and also the same for staff. There will be a complaints procedure that needs to be part of that induction process so that all staff are aware of how to actually go about sorting out any things that require a complaint. Workplace injury and illness and disease recording. There are typically, online forms or folders, physical folders sometimes, where the details of any workplace injury, illness or diseases can be recorded. And this will include things like the date that it happened, the circumstances around which it happened, who was there when it happened, symptoms, let's say, or gravity of injury, where on the body the injury occurred, etc., etc. Protective clothing and footwear is a really important and sometimes underrated OCHEL safety policy and procedure. Typically there will be some sort of polo shirt or uniform that's expected for childcare workers in a childcare centre to wear. This doesn't necessarily translate to a school environment. However, a lot of primary schools will have the option for staff to purchase some sort of staff uniform. This will include, as we mentioned before, the types of footwear and making sure that there is covered footwear. And you need to make sure that you're wearing the right clothes, or you can actually risk being sent home. Some of that pertains to your legal expectation about, complying with the policies of your workplace. Some of that is about how you're presenting yourself professionally. As an assistant principal, I have had to have slightly awkward conversations, I suppose, with particularly some of our practicum students who might be on school grounds, just about making sure that they are presenting themselves in a really professional manner in keeping with the policies and procedures of the school environment. And of course, maintaining professional development and supervision is a really ongoing and important part of ensuring that staff are safe and have the knowledge to be able to keep themselves safe and also the children with whom they are caring. So some of the ways that managers can attempt to keep their staff safe is not just, as I mentioned before, limited to physical safety. It's also about their psychological safety and about their legal safety. So if we look at this table here, if we look on the right-hand side first, we can see that there are some ways that managers need to ensure that adequate training and adequate equipment, which is in a good standard, has been provided so that people can be safe physically while they are doing their job. Obviously, in a childcare centre and OSH and things like that, there may be the existence of a kitchen or a kitchen area, and often in kitchens there are naturally things that are hazardous, things like hot stoves, things like boiling water, things like sharp knives. So making sure that the training that is required for people who are involved in food preparation in centres and schools is up to date, and also making sure that equipment is only in reach of the staff members who are going to be using it and all of those sorts of things. And anybody who is going to be preparing food for children understands how to use that equipment safely. First aid rules for centres and schools can differ slightly across Australia. In Western Australia, ensuring that there is a first aid trained, at least one first aid trained person within a space that children are occupying seems to be the current practice. In other states around Australia, that can be different. So making sure that managers are adhering to whatever their state regulations and laws are about, having adequate first aid trained staff on hand in places where children are being cared for. Things like using ladders and handling heavy goods. There are some ladders that are not okay to be used in a school. Recently, at the most recent school I worked at, we had to replace all of our ladders because they weren't compliant with the regulations for the types of ladders that needed to be, and the age of the ladder that needed to be used, and also how to ascend a ladder and how to descend a ladder, and whether you need someone to spot you, etc., etc. So there's a little bit of procedural knowledge that needs to go with staff who are going to be using ladders and lifting, handling heavy things. We mentioned before some manual handling around the lifting of children. This is slightly different in a childcare centre than it is in a school, given that you're dealing with often much younger children. Practices around how they ascend up into a change table and descend, and what the rules are in, baby rooms, what the rules are for particular children with additional needs, who may need to be lifted, who have, different reasons why they cannot, move around themselves. Over time can be quite hazardous to staff if correct lifting procedures are not adhered to in terms of how they can damage their backs. And that can be really debilitating if that's not done correctly. So having clear information, visual information for how to lift, bend your knees and all of those sorts of things, and how to reduce the amount that we are lifting children, looking at other ways of meeting children's needs in situations where we may not need to lift them. However, of course, there will always be times when we will need to. And then the last one there is fire emergency equipment and fire drills. All staff need to be aware of where fire extinguishers are kept, or fire blankets, or other sorts of fire management equipment, and to know how to conduct a safe fire drill, because in the emergency, of course, we want to make sure that all staff are safe as well as children. And often the staff are instrumental in keeping those children safe in an emergency such as a fire. So some of those physical aspects there are essential to be able to maintain our legal obligation as managers in staff safety. On the left-hand side of the table, we are looking a little bit more at legal safety. So how do we as managers keep, one of our responsibilities is to ensure that we are providing staff with enough information and training to protect them from accusations that may manifest in a court case or, accusation of negligence. So in terms of child protection training, we need to keep staff aware of any new legislation and any changes to procedure. We need to undertake regular refresher courses, and we need to check with new members of staff who are, more vulnerable because they're new and they're still learning all the procedures and policies, and just to find out when they last underwent any training themselves. And we need to keep a record of their training to show who has attended the training and when they attended it, because over time we do forget, and also over time sometimes policies change or they're updated. So we need to be retraining and updating our skills in that space. And as managers, we may need to provide additional and scheduled and recurrent professional development for staff. Handling children, as I mentioned before, we're just having some clear guidelines on what is permissible and what is not permissible. Go over this often with staff and check that everybody understands and that it means the same thing. It's a really good idea to minute those meetings, have someone, record the agenda of those types of meetings and list the people who were present, because unfortunately these are the types of documents that will be quite powerful in a court of law if a parent accuses a staff member of mishandling their child. Maintaining confidentiality is a really important component of being a childcare worker or being a early childhood educator. All staff should understand that as a professional expectation, this is critical. We need to treat all information about children as confidential, and we do not discuss matters outside the setting or in the hearing of non-staff members. So this can get really tricky, when we are carrying a lot of knowledge about the children under our care, and when we are going home to our families and when we're talking to our friends, we need to be really mindful of how we're speaking and not to share information that would actually breach this level of confidentiality. Giving medicines and drugs, it's important there's an emergency procedures policy in place that can set out clearly what staff can do and what staff can't do in terms of giving medication or other emergency care. And we've talked about this in a previous tutorial about sort of following the prescription as prescribed by a doctor in its original packaging. Knowing what the rights and responsibilities of parents are in terms of medicine and drugs, what's going to happen stage by stage in a medical emergency. There will be children who you will be caring for who will require certain medication and certain drugs for short periods of time, and some of them are on medications or drugs for long periods of time as it may pertain to their particular medical condition. So we need to have a very clear and very transparent understanding and communication between parent and centre or parent and school about effective and correct ways of administering medication. Adequate supervision is the one that has come up repeatedly throughout this course. Clear policies, ensuring that all staff are aware of their responsibilities, is a really important responsibility of a manager. Highlight the importance of adequate supervision at all times with all staff. A lot of the building and equipment risk assessments need to identify areas that can pose a risk to staff in a childcare centre. And you need to ensure that staff are aware of this and that they have received the appropriate training. So in addition to some of the things previously mentioned, we do need to make sure that equipment is well maintained and is used safely. Any faulty equipment needs to be disposed of safely, or it needs to be sent for repair. Anything that is awaiting repair needs to be effectively labelled, stating as such that not to use, to warn staff not to use this item, it's, waiting to be repaired. And then making sure that staff are trained with how to actually use those pieces of equipment. It's really important too that training is provided to staff for lots of different situations, and sometimes training is actually instructing them on when not to use something or when not to follow through with something. Talking to your staff about keeping themselves safe, manual handling things like when they're moving furniture or when they're putting up displays, when they're carrying heavy bags of sand to replenish the sand tray, etc. Making sure that staff are doing these things in the normal course of their work, but in a safe way. It is also really important that every single staff member knows the routines and practices them with the children, and has the capacity to be able to seek support from more experienced colleagues or their line managers, for example, in the event where they're unsure about what their next steps can be. So in the end, we do need to be as prepared as possible, but we also need to expect the unexpected because, obviously accidents can happen, emergencies can happen, and hazards need to be managed as effectively as they can be. A key responsibility of being a manager is that we are complying with our occupational health and safety regulations, but also that we are ensuring our employees are complying with the OSH regulations. We address compliance by having in place a range of health safety policies and procedures, but the question remains, is this, so having policies and procedures, sufficient to ensure that all employees understand the nature of their OC health safety obligations? Managers cannot assume that every team member has a sound understanding or knowledge of OSH. Employee training can ensure that all staff receive the same information, which can then be used as a baseline for ongoing training. These types of training might include how to identify and manage infectious diseases, storage and safe handling of chemicals, stress management, first aid training, etc. The processes we typically used in training staff include at induction and orientation, and then some ongoing training needs to be regarded as a continuous process. As a manager, when you have staff for whom you are, legally responsible, it can be a little bit frustrating to think that you have made sure that, let's say, for example, you've trained everybody who currently works in your centre around safe handling of chemicals, so you've ticked all that box, and then inevitably somebody will leave and somebody else will come and be a new employee, and they may or may not have had that training. So thinking about OSH training as an ongoing process, it's sort of like a recurrent process, and you have to keep track of this perpetual cycle of different trainings people have completed and different people entering and different people leaving. So it is not something that's kind of, one and done. It is something that needs to be planned on a recurrent basis so that everybody at least has a date for when they know they will be trained, and there are procedures and policies in place in the interim until they are. When we are assessing hazards, there is a hierarchy of risk control that can assist us in assessing these hazards. So this can help us determine different strategies for controlling the risks that are presented. When an unacceptable risk is identified, controls need to be used to minimise the risk. The most effective control, so elimination of the risk, is at the top of the hierarchy, but not all types of control would be appropriate in all situations, okay? So at the very top, the most effective, it says, can you eliminate the hazard? If you can, remove the hazard completely so that it's no longer a threat. Now, sometimes this is not completely possible. It can be a level of expertise that is not shared by the staff member, so they're not able to remove the threat. Sometimes it's because it is part of a system where you can't isolate or separate it. So if you look going down this hierarchy, there are different questions that you can ask yourself to see whether this risk can be minimised. All the way down to providing the person with personal protective equipment, so PPE being worn and used correctly. It is important to remember that accidents are unpredictable, and when unforeseen situations arise, people might respond differently. Some people are going to respond calmly and efficiently, but other people are going to overreact and they might become distraught and they may even panic. When you're managing occupational health and safety, that human factor, so that response, that human response that people have to accidents needs to be taken into consideration. The Occupational Safety and Health Act of 2000 requires all workplace injuries and near misses to be properly and accurately recorded. If you were working in a childcare centre, what details do you think would need to be included in this type of Occ Health Safety report? Please hit pause and just jot down a couple of details you think might need to be included in such a report, and then come back when you're ready. Okay, so some of the details that would go onto an Occ Health Safety report and a near miss report for any accidents that occur and that have caused injury. The name, address and occupation of the person injured or the person who was nearly injured need to be included. The date and time when it occurred. The circumstances around how it occurred need to be briefly explained. The location, so where in the centre this near miss or accident occurred. What was the type of injury and what was the part of the body injured? Some of these forms have sort of, outlines of humans, and you can sort of just kind of mark on the human where the injury occurred on the body. What was the activity that was being conducted at the time? What were the details or the use of safety equipment relevant to this activity at the time? So was safety equipment being used? How much time was lost resulting from the injury? So in terms of supporting that person who had been injured to, finishing up and making sure that, business as usual happened again. What was that sort of lost time there? And near misses also can take up a lot of time. And what also was the treatment administered? Children's services workplaces are extremely diverse, and they include things like family daycare homes, purpose-built centres, buildings renovated to accommodate these services, community halls, school halls, classrooms, and a variety of outdoor play spaces. And although Occ Health Safety is usually taken to relate to adults, all children's services contain hazards that pose risk to the health and safety of both adults and children. So we need to be able to determine as managers that the practice can demonstrate its Occ Health Safety commitment. So recording some of these details in the event of an injury or a near miss is really important to be able to evaluate and establish, are there any patterns here? Is it always in this area of the centre that injuries are occurring? Or, why are people always hurting their, right finger, when they're doing this particular activity? So having clear records of these types of things can be really informative in the prevention of future injuries. So we're going to pull all of this together into a scenario, and then I'm going to ask you to respond to a couple of questions as it relates back to those first few weeks of this course when we were looking at whether or not a breach of duty of care has occurred, and if an action was based on negligence, would liability be determined. So this is the situation. For several months now, carers at the Super Tots Childcare Centre have asked management to repair a large crack that's appeared in the path near the back veranda. The committee have decided that they're going to wait until they've got enough funds to replace the whole path rather than simply patching the crack. Now the crack has widened and it has created an uneven surface and a trip hazard. Today is Grandparents' Day and Friends' Day at the service, and little Giovanna is keen to show her grandma the outdoor playground. Giovanna pulls on her grandmother's arm, telling her to hurry. Giovanna's grandmother is so busy talking to Giovanna that she doesn't notice the cracked and uneven path. She trips and she falls heavily onto her knees. Both Giovanna and her grandmother begin to cry. So this is the situation. The question for you, the first question is, has there been a breach of duty of care? Now you need to justify your answer to this question according to those 5 factors about the breach of duty of care. As a reminder, those are: was there foreseeability of harm? What's the magnitude of the risk of that harm occurring? What's the gravity of the harm that could take place? What is the cost and practicability of preventing it? And what are the justifications for running the risk? So in a moment, I want you to hit pause and just determine, according to those 5 factors, what's your response to each of those in this instance. Foreseeability of harm, magnitude of risk, gravity of harm, cost and practicability of prevention, and justifications for running the risk. Hit pause now and do that section and then come back. Okay, hello, welcome back. Now, whether or not you have determined if that there is a breach of duty of care, your responses to those 5 factors are going to inform this next part. The next question says, if there was an action based on negligence, a legal action, the question is, could the childcare centre be held liable? Now, if you recall, in determining whether or not there's been negligence, liability depends on 3 interrelated requirements. The tort of negligence can be claimed when duty of care is owed. So, is there a relationship where there's an extrinsic or intrinsic obligation to offer a duty of care? The second is a duty of care breached? So this is the failure in the standard of care where standard expectations failed in a circumstance and reasonable care was not taken. And the third being that the damages were caused by that breach. Was the physical harm or injury caused by the failure to take reasonable care? In other words, the causation of harm is directly linked to that breach. Hit pause now and see if you can respond to those 3 questions. Was duty of care owed? Was duty of care breached? And were the damages caused by that breach? Come back when you're ready. Okay, hello again. I am hopeful that in terms of those 5 factors of duty of care, that those were applicable in this instance. So the centre does have a duty of care and that duty of care was breached by their inaction about addressing that hazard. And if this was brought to a civil court and the tort of negligence was claimed, liability would likely be assigned to that childcare centre because they did have a duty of care, they did breach their duty of care, and the damage was directly caused by that breach. So make sure that you're able to respond to situations like this leading into the exam. Understand those factors that determine breach of duty of care and understand the 3 interrelated requirements of determining liability of negligence. Your personal safety as an employee and your personal safety as an employer are really important aspects of how we are meeting our legal and professional obligations. There are procedures and guidelines for staff when they find themselves alone in a building. And some policies and procedures will ensure that staff are not alone, so there will always be at least a minimum of 2 people. But in some situations, you may find that you might be the very last person in a building. So make sure that there is a strategy in place for you to be able to handle that. So things like always locking the door behind you, making sure you have your mobile phone on you at all times. Consider the lighting outside. Are your staff going to be vulnerable when they're getting in or out of their cars if it's later at night and it's dark? And are there overhanging bushes and things like that that people could potentially hide in? So as managers, we do have a responsibility to ensuring the personal safety of our employees as they are arriving and leaving work safely. We need to make sure we talk to staff about this. It's best to do that together, and you might draw up a list of safety measures that everybody understands that they need to meet. Another aspect of personal safety is the potential for parental conflict. We need to let parents know that under no circumstances will violence or abuse be tolerated, and there needs to be explicit notices up where parents can see them, reminding them of this. This is often a condition of enrolment, but it does need to be re-established and not just left up to, well, we did that at enrolment and now we don't need to do it anymore because they signed the papers. It needs to be obvious and regularly communicated. In the event that a parent or another adult, sometimes it's a grandparent, sometimes a friend, etc., abuses a member of staff either verbally or physically, You need to have an agreed procedure to be able to respond to this. You need to discuss this procedure with all of your staff. You need to brainstorm ideas for ways to respond that are going to suit your specific needs. You must let parents know that you will not tolerate any violence, and you need to have these notices where they can see them. And similar to those types of notices that we can see around in hospitals, there is zero tolerance. There is no excuse for abuse. And you will need to make sure that part of your procedure that you're setting up includes calling the police in the event where an adult is unable to control their behaviour and is verbally or physically abusing people and is not responding to the steps that you're putting in place. The third aspect of personal safety that we're going to be talking about is about stress and how we as managers need to try and keep our employees safe from stress. As employers, we need to be as supportive as we can. Sometimes we're going to have to redelegate responsibilities if it's going to be something short-term or a passing phase. We need to make ourselves available to talk to staff, and we've got to watch for any danger signs that we can observe as affecting our employees. As individuals, we need to make sure we're adopting a healthy lifestyle. Getting plenty of rest and having regular exercise and a healthy diet are instrumental to be able to manage any symptoms of stress as they arise. It's important to recognise that stress is not an illness, nor will it necessarily damage your person or your personality. However, at its worst, stress can be associated with or even trigger many psychological and physiological conditions like anxiety, depression, even heart disease, back pain, and gastrointestinal illnesses. Research suggests that in 2009, so a few years ago, around 9.8 million working days were lost through work-related stress, and so one of the most common causes of sickness absence. Stress also has very costly and time-consuming implications for employers, with the average amount of time taken off by somebody who is suffering from work-related stress being 22.6 days. Now that number has increased in the years since 2009, so employers are heavily invested in managing workplace stress, not just for financial reasons, but also, and productivity reasons, but also because they have an obligation to care for their staff health and well-being. Okay, so how do we try and deal with stress in the workplace as it pertains to early childhood education and care? To be safe from stress, we need to understand that work-related stress is defined as the adverse reaction people have to excessive pressure or other types of demand placed on them. Stress is one of the most serious problems facing teachers today. Employers are responsible for the effects of workplace stress on their employees. Now, this is a difficult one because what stresses one person could be a welcome challenge for somebody else. Some staff might have personal problems and they might be prone to stress. We need to encourage staff to work as a team and to share responsibilities and authority, to support each other as kind of formal mentors, but also as professional friends. We need to assess their emotional needs as well as their professional development. If you show your staff that you value them, they will be more likely to accept challenges and then to enjoy the rewards of the achievement as it relates to that challenge. Teaching and caring is an increasingly demanding job. It has escalating pressure levels at different times. Our research shows that teachers now face greater occupational stress than most other employees. Now, it's not always easy to identify those situations that are going to cause stress to a particular employee. People have different capabilities and they have different lives, and all of these things affect their ability to tolerate stressful situations. Employees can often resist telling their employer that they feel unable to cope or that they're being bullied at work. But employers need to be on the lookout for stress symptoms in staff, and in some circumstances, employers are under a duty to notice stress without being told of it by the employee affected. Sometimes stress is unavoidable. On a temporary basis, it's unlikely to cause significant problems. However, When the situation becomes permanent, employers need to reconsider the ways in which their businesses are operating and monitor the various issues that are triggering stress. Working in children's services can also present a risk to mental health. A significant number of compensation claims from the childcare industry relate to stress. So what are some common causes of workplace stress? The three that are typically raised are work overload, bullying and harassment, or traumatic incidents. Harassment is defined as that behaviour that is unwanted, unwelcome, and offensive. When we look at those traumatic incidents, this can be either in the childcare centre, for example, the serious injury of a child who was in physical danger, or it can even be a near miss, can cause quite a lot of trauma. A personal issue, perhaps the death of a family member or a friend, a divorce or a separation or financial difficulties. All of these traumatic incidents can place excessive demands on employees. And when employees are overburdened with work from a high workload and expecting people to do too much, we understand that childcare is hard work, but it shouldn't be made harder with unreasonable expectations. If there are, for example, unrealistic rosters, if there is a lack of control where employees have little or no say over the way that they do their jobs, or a lack of support where employees feel there's nobody to turn to or no one acknowledges their achievements when they do something, those things can all start to lead to frustration and stress. In terms of bullying and harassment, the frustration that can build in employees might stem from having problems with particular colleagues. Perhaps these poor relationships at work are leading to bullying. Or it can be from uncertainty over the role. If employees are unclear as to what they need to do to fulfill their expectations and perhaps what other staff need to do to fulfill their expectations and where there's overlap and where there's separation, can cause a lot of stress and confusion, and it can also damage working relationships. Sometimes change in the workplace can cause employees to feel insecure and uncertain about some major decisions that are affecting the business. So, the threat of injury, the threat of being sacked or observing favouritism, all of these factors are common causes of workplace stress. I'm sure you can think of some more, but a lot of those, the pressure of work overload, the frustration at bullying and harassment, and just the stress of being involved in traumatic incidents are the most common ones that we tend to see. As early childhood educators, we are regularly coping with day-to-day issues, and we're being expected to support families who might be going through various crises or who are experiencing emotionally stressful circumstances. The level of stress a person feels is determined by the way that they respond to a particular situation. When staff numbers are reduced, pressure increases on the remaining employees to perform well. And while pressure can be helpful in motivating employees, it can also reach a bit of a tipping point where employees are no longer performing to the best of their abilities. A stress-related departure or sickness absence can put further unwelcome pressure on the business and its workforce. It's really important then that as early childhood educators, we understand where our responsibilities are, and that we are bringing our own sense of management and responsibility to ourselves. So if we're noticing stress-related responses or symptoms building up in ourselves, it is always a good idea to just go and have that conversation, that tricky conversation with your line manager. In the event that the stress is being caused by your line manager, then you might need to seek out different ways or different people or different touch points that you can go to be able to discuss what's going on and what your next steps might be. Educators need to understand their own personal security, and if our bodies are experiencing stress as it relates to another person, particularly if it's from, let's say, a particular parent, then our body will recognise that parent as a threat, and it will start to physically react when we sort of see that person or in that person's vicinity. So we need to make sure that we are able to conduct our work safely, both psychologically and physically. We're going to revisit now that notion of negligence that we learnt about in the first few weeks of this course, because It is possible for an employee in an early childhood setting to claim damages for their employer's negligence if they suffer from a stress-related injury. Now, to succeed with such a claim, an employee would need to show, as with any personal injury claim, that the employer breached their duty of care and that the injury occurred as a result. There's no specific law on workplace stress, and this can make it hard for employers to manage stress among their staff. It can be difficult to identify a stressed individual and to identify the employer's legal obligations in response. The law on workplace stress comes from case law, in other words, previous cases that have been presented in courts. We will look at the different types of claims that an employee can bring and how an employer can defend against them. So as a reminder, to be able to prove negligence and succeed, there needs to prove that the employer broke the duty of care owed to the employee, that the employer could reasonably have foreseen injury resulting from that breach of duty, and then that the employee suffered personal injury as a result of the breach. An employee who is suffering from stress can bring a personal injury claim in the county court or high court against an employer for negligence over the employee's health and safety. The cases tend to focus on the issue of reasonable foreseeability. The courts have taken an increasingly robust approach to this in terms of how accountable employers can be. Duty of care requires employers to ensure that all carers are reasonably competent to do the work, there are sufficient numbers of people to do the work, that the workplace is safe, that there is proper equipment, that there are reasonably safe systems or methods of work, and both the employer, often represented by the director or nominated supervisor, and the employee are required to take reasonable care to avoid causing harm to other people. So your responsibilities include, firstly, cooperating and complying with your employer's attempts to meet their legal obligations. So this means you've got to follow instructions about how to use equipment. You've got to undertake the training and you need to keep yourself informed about OC health and safety. It also means that we take an active role to ensure the health and safety of colleagues and visitors to the service, and that we report all workplace hazards to our employers in a timely manner. So what has some of this case law determined? In the case of Johnston versus the Health Department of 1991, the employer was found to reasonably have foreseen that requiring an employee to work excessive hours could damage the employee's health. In Lancaster versus Mosman City Council in 1999, the council had to accept liability for the employee's stress-related illness, which began after she'd repeatedly said she needed training to do her duties. A stress-related injury can be physical, like a heart attack, or it can be psychiatric, like a breakdown. Long hours often cause stress. The working time regulations limit the working week to 48 hours in most cases, and in practice many employees will frequently work far longer than this. Long working hours can be a significant contributor to work-related stress, and they can be particularly relevant where employees are increasing or changing an employee's workload, so daily and weekly rest breaks and breaks while at work and breaks between shifts. Employers should ensure that they keep records of employees' working hours, their rest breaks and leave. They should take action where necessary to ensure that employees are not overworked. Employers have a responsibility to ensure that all staff are adequately trained to perform their duties to the best of their abilities. Once an employer becomes aware that an employee is suffering from a stress-related illness, they are expected to take steps in response that are reasonable in the circumstances. It is foreseeable that this might cause further harm, so the steps that should be taken will depend on those familiar factors. What's the magnitude of the risk? What's the gravity of the harm? What's the cost and the practicalities associated with prevention? And what are the justifications for running the risk based on the resources that are available? Okay, so how can we actually work to prevent too much stress in the workplace? A key component is to take action before it becomes too late or before the situation becomes so dire. So in terms of being with it, that means Know what's going on. If you are watching out for symptoms of stress in others, then you might be able to, intervene and be able to have an effect before the situation gets really, really bad. Physical symptoms can include fatigue, back pain, insomnia, headaches, sweating, high blood pressure, etc. Some mental symptoms. Is there increased anxiety or persistent anxiety, irritability, poor memory, poor concentration, poor decision making? What are some emotional symptoms? Are staff presenting with irrational fears, irrational anger, panic, or depression? If a stress at work problem looks like it might be rearing its ugly head, just don't ignore it. Take some legal advice as soon as possible. Having a sense of belonging and connectedness can act as a protective factor against mental health problems and mental illnesses. Workplace research has linked a lack of belonging and social isolation to burnout. Belonging has been linked with people's capacity to persist with activities, to be motivated to undertake tasks and roles, as well as assisting people to achieve outcomes, sometime in the face of adverse or negative circumstances. Importantly, there is evidence that having a sense of belonging is an important contributor in being able to help others to belong. Okay, so to sum up, both employers and employees have legal obligations. These issues need to be part of the induction of every new member of staff at whatever level of competence or authority they are, including their work experience, and those who are in training, as well as students who might be visiting your workplace. They should be contained in induction packs and staff handbooks. Summaries should be in your handbooks and posted where parents and staff can access them. Employers have to ensure that all employees are informed of their rights, obligations and responsibilities, and are provided with sufficient training in order to comply with all of their OCHEL safety policies and procedures. It's very important to be vigilant and aware of your own legal and ethical responsibilities. It may take a while to fully understand how all this information, all these regulations and standards and legal obligations are going to apply to your work in childcare, but it will all make sense when you do your prac. You will need to be alert, observant, use your common sense, and tell a more qualified, experienced staff member or an appropriate person outside the service if you have concerns. Make sure you're assessed using the quality areas and standards. Thanks everyone, that concludes today's lecture. I'll see you at the tutorial.